Barrages of rocket fire continue to rain down on the people of Gaza and Israel as the conflict there reaches its 7th day with no end in sight and the possibility looming of an Israeli ground offensive. Palestinian authorities claim more than 100 civilians have been killed, while there have been no casualties in Israel. The escalation began over a fortnight ago with the murder of 3 young Israelis and a young Palestinian boy burnt to death by Israeli nationalists. Internationally, the conflict has been condemned as futile, while inside Israel, senior figures have criticised the government for its failure to seek a long-term solution to the problems of people living in the occupied territories. Spokesman for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mark Regev, joined me earlier from Tel Aviv. Mark Regev, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by going back to where this recent conflict began to escalate, with the murder of 3 young Israelis and the murder of a 16-year-old Palestinian. That young man had petrol forced down his throat before being burnt to death. What caused such a brutal crime against a young man?
There's no excuse whatsoever for that sort of crime. My boss, Prime Minister Netanyahu, spoke to the father of that teen, and he expressed his own condolences and that of the entire piece of Israel. He said, "We promised to bring the perpetrators of that atrocious murder to justice, and we have done so. At the moment, we've got people in custody. There will be prosecutions, and these people will bear the full brunt of the law. That sort of crime is not tolerated in Israel. It won't be tolerated, and there's no room in our society for those sort of criminals."
At the same time, though, a number of leading Israeli writers, including Chemi Shalev, said it wasn't a response to the killing of the young settlers, for example, but something bigger in Israel, an unchecked racism. Does Netanyahu at the same time take responsibility for allowing that racism to continue unchecked?
You know, in every society, you have extremists on the fringe. In Israel, in Australia, I dare say everywhere. The question is, what does leadership do about it? Does leadership condemn it unequivocally? And in Israel, the answer is clearly yes. Do we act against vigilante violence, against hate crimes with the full force of the law? Yes, we do. And the quick arrests following this terrible atrocity, I think, show that we have a no-tolerance policy for this sort of violence.
It's not just writers talking about this. The former head of your own internal security service, the Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin, issued a scathing attack on your government just a couple of days ago for failing to deal with these issues, for failing to deal with Arab inequality in Israel, for allowing more settlement building. He knows what's going on inside your country, doesn't he?
He's, of course, entitled to his opinion, and he's got a very clear political position in opposition to my Prime Minister, and that's his right in our democracy. We have, if you want to talk about Israel's Arab citizens, who make up about 19% of our country, we have a policy of affirmative action. In other words, if you have a government job available and you have 2 candidates who are equal, you have to give preference to the minority candidate, to the Arab Israeli. We have the same now in education budgets and so forth, because there have been historic gaps. Our Declaration of Independence promises equality for all our citizens, and we are determined to get there, to make sure that all Israelis
I'm going to have to come in and interrupt you there and say that the reality on the ground.
We've always had equality under the law. The
reality on the ground is obviously not that, and this is what Yuval Diskin is saying, that whatever is the result of this bombing campaign, and we'll come to it in just a second, that the enormous pressures in the West Bank and inside Israel will remain, whatever happens as a result.
It's true, there are pressures. I mean, ultimately, Arab Israelis are in a very special situation because, of course, they're Israeli citizens and they enjoy all the freedoms of Israeli democracy. They, of course, as Arabs, do have an affinity with the people we are fighting against. And, of course, Israel is formally in a state of war with Syria, with Lebanon, with other Arab countries, and they have a sensitive situation. We understand that. And we are making our best, doing a maximum effort to make them feel at home in Israel.
Let's just talk about the rocket attacks. Why would Israel bomb a home for the disabled in Gaza?
Look, I can tell you we do not target civilians. I say that unequivocally. I was in a meeting yesterday and it was specifically said that even if we have a senior terrorist leader, someone who we want to take out, if we know that innocent civilians will be hurt, we will call off the operation. We do not see the people of Gaza as our enemy. Our enemy are the terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad and the others, who are indiscriminately shooting rockets at our people, and we want to end that rocket fire.
You say you don't target civilians, but the question is the amount of care that's taken to avoid hurting civilians. There was a rocket attack on the home of the Gaza police chief. He has known sympathies to Hamas. At the same time, a number of children were killed in that attack. Do you take enough care to avoid those casualties? Because it appears the answer is no.
I know in that specific attack, first of all, warnings were sent that the house was going to be targeted because it was part of the Hamas command and control structure. After that, there was what we would call a warning shot, which is like a large firecracker, which makes a lot of noise so people know there's going to be an attack. We did not want to see civilians hurt. We make every effort. Look, it's a very complex combat situation because Hamas deliberately embeds itself amongst the civilian population, exploiting Gaza's population as a human shield. They even talk publicly about exploiting Gaza's civilians as human shields.
You're now talking about a potential ground offensive. The question I think that everybody is asking outside Israel and outside Gaza, Mark Regev, on behalf of your government, is where does this end?
Well, it ends in peace. It ends in a peace treaty between Israelis and Palestinians where we have two states for two people, where the Palestinian people finally recognize that the Jewish state has a right to live in peace and recognition, and we have good neighbors. And the Palestinians, in the framework of ending the conflict, have their own state too. The problem is that Hamas is a violent enemy of peace. Not that Mark Regev says so, they say so openly. Just read the Hamas charter, where they say that the Jewish state has no right to exist in any borders. It has to be destroyed.
In this case, you're going to have to eventually
terrorism, violent jihad is the way to achieve that. And
you're going to have to sit down with Hamas in order to secure that solution. Do you accept that?
No, I do not accept that, unfortunately, unless Hamas changes. And if they change, if they magically moderate their positions, that'll be a whole new ballgame. But Hamas is stuck in a very extremist position that is antithetical to peace. They're the opposite of peace. They say so openly. You know, tomorrow, if a Palestinian leader was to sign a peace treaty with Israel, Hamas would probably try to kill him.
Mark Regev, are we going to see a full-scale ground offensive, do you expect now?
It's possible. The government has instructed the army to be prepared for any option. Our goal is, and it's ultimately very defensive, our goal is to bring peace and quiet, a sustained period of peace and quiet, to the people of Israel, who should not have to live under these constant rocket barrages. That's our goal, to protect our people. I'd ask you, if rockets were coming from some frontier with Australia on Australian citizens, from terrorists across the border, what would the Australian people demand of the Australian government? I know. They'd demand that this has to end, and that's the right of the Israeli people too, to end the fire of rockets from across the border.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark Regev, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.